and welcome to our first day of Faculty Perspectives. As a reminder, we will offer 5 faculty perspectives each Thursday from now until the end of August. We will present these in tracks. Track 1, which we did this morning, is focused on interdisciplinary presentations on COVID-19. We will present these live every Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. Track 2 is focused on efforts to dismantle systematic racism in the United States. The anti-racism track will be presented live at noon Pacific Time every Thursday. Track 3 is called Sustainability and Climate Change. And over the course of the next 8 weeks, we will hear from multiple areas that study the effects and science of both. And Track 3 will be presented at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Time every Thursday. Track 4, which is the one that you're tuned into now, is all about Engaged Humanities, which will explore the human experience and ingenuity through language, literature, visual, and spoken storytelling. These will be at 3 p.m. Pacific Time on Thursdays. And our final track, Track 5, is all about entrepreneurship and innovation. Leaders in business, design, and science will present over these 8 weeks, Track 5, and each will be presented at 4:30 Pacific Time every Thursday. I do want to point out that in the Q&A on Zoom, you can ask your questions. Our presenter will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes this afternoon, and then we'll have time for live questions. And I'll be looking at your questions on my phone, and we'll be offering those questions up to our presenter. Our first presenter for Track 3 from the Engaged Humanities track is going to ask the big question, why are some social movements more effective than others? Please welcome Professor of History, Steve Beda. Hello, Professor Beda.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Cora. My name is Steve Beda. I teach in the history department, and I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research, about how I go about teaching history, give you a sense of what it's like to study history at the college level, and also I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about one of the major questions that is central to both my research and teaching, this question of why are some social movements more effective than others. So let me start a little bit talking about what it is I do. So history, huge topic. Thousands upon thousands of years of history. Every continent, every country, every community has a history. So there's a lot you can study in history. And me and my colleagues, we all have specialties we focus on. And I guarantee you that if whatever you're interested in the past, there is probably someone in the history department or some of the other great departments at the UO who share that interest. So there's lots of ways you can explore history here at UO. But what I specifically focus on is 20th century American history, and specifically social history. I really see myself as a social historian. So what does that mean to be a social historian? Well, as a social historian, I largely study social movements. Movements like the women's movement, the labor movement, the environmentalist movement, anti-war movements throughout history. I try and understand how these movements came together, how they functioned, how they worked, what they changed, and what they didn't change. So to really, I think, understand how I see history and how I want students taking my classes to see history, we got to understand a little bit about what I see myself as not doing. So many of you who have taken high school history classes, the way history is often taught in high school is it's the history of great men, and often great white men. I think a lot of people associate the study of American history with the study of presidents. I know when I took history in high school, I hated it. I thought it was the most boring thing because mostly we just talked about presidents, political leaders. We talked about great white men. I think maybe my high school history textbook had a paragraph about the important figure you see on the top right, Martin Luther King. I can guarantee you it had absolutely nothing about Malcolm X, who's pictured on the bottom right there. I think that's probably changed a little bit in recent years. I was in high school more than 20 years ago. I don't like to think about that. But yeah, now you probably get a little bit more information about the civil rights movement, and you probably have more than just a paragraph about someone like Martin Luther King. maybe your textbook or in your high school history class even learned a little bit about Malcolm X. But even if your high school history class did talk about the civil rights movement and figures like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, you were still often talking about the leaders of these movements. And of course, the leaders of these movements are hugely important. And presidents and politicians and powerful figures, they are hugely important. And the policies they pass and the programs they enact have huge impacts on all peoples. But really what interests me are less the leaders of social movements and less big powerful politicians and more the everyday people who joined social movements. So I want to know, so on the left side of your screen there you see a picture of two young immigrant women who were part of the labor movement in the early 20th century, particularly organizing textile workers in eastern United States. Over on the right there, you see a civil rights protest around the World War II era. And in the center picture, you see striking sanitation workers in Memphis in 1968. That was the campaign where Martin Luther King was assassinated. I want to know why people like these joined social movements. I want to know what brought those two young girls into the labor movement or brought those men holding the I am a man sign into the Memphis Sanitation Workers Union and what prompted them to take action against their employer and strike in 1968. These are the questions I'm concerned with. You know, to put this issue a little bit differently, or to explain to you in a different way what it is I'm interested in history and what I look for in history is, take this picture. This is a famous picture from the 1963 March on Washington led by Martin Luther King and several other prominent civil rights leaders. You know, when we think about a movement like the March on Washington, or when we see some pictures of the March on Washington like this one, King is often at the forefront. And of course, as I said, King and the people who were also there at the, you know, on the stage at the 1963 March on Washington, hugely important figures, and our understanding of history would be incomplete without them. But I am more curious about the people in that audience. What brought them to that march? Why were they willing to follow King? How did they sometimes challenge his leadership? How did they support his leadership? Those are the things I want to know. I want to get into the lives and experiences of the people whose names have often been lost to history. And that's really what motivates me, that's what motivates my research, and that's really what motivates my teaching. And so in my classes, we often try and uncover the experiences of people like, you know, in the crowd at the 1963 March on Washington, understand what they were feeling, what they were thinking, and what ultimately motivated them to participate in a movement like the civil rights movement. So to kind of get a little bit more specific, you know, the major questions my research asks is, how do people organize social movements? How do people start organizations, you know, organize marches, organize boycotts, all the things that are part of a social movement? How do people, what's the kind of architecture of that? Also, why do people decide to join a social movement? You know, I talked about the labor movement just briefly before, and there are large segments of, you know, the working class population in American history who have joined unions and some who haven't joined unions. And I want to know, why is it that some workers join unions and others don't? Why is it that some people joined in the civil rights movement and others didn't? So why do people decide to join social movements? But the most important question I ask in both my teaching and research, the question that's really central to everything I do and that really kind of motivates everything I do as a historian is this question: why are some social movements more effective than others? And so I think this is a really, really important question. And here's why. So my clicker stopped working. Okay, there we go. All right. So here's why this question is important about the effectiveness of social movements, or how social movements become effective. Is trying to change the political system, trying to create more racial equity, economic equity, challenging the powerful, that is often a risky thing in history. Whenever we see movements of people trying to change the political, social, or economic system, we see those movements being repressed. This was true for the civil rights movement throughout the 20th century. It was true of the labor movement. It's been true of the women's movement as well, that oftentimes movements are, you know, these movements for change are suppressed. just tell you next, yeah, so next slide. Now, of course, as we know, for those of us who have followed the news recently, this is just as true today. We've seen protesters protesting the murder of George Floyd and protesting for efforts to defund the police. We've seen these movements met with violence and tear gas and rubber bullets and all sorts of horrific things. So what we're seeing going on with the Black Lives Matter movement today and how there is an attempt to suppress this movement, it has, has antecedents in history. And so here is why I study the past. Here is why I answer this question. Still not, okay. Focusing on the successes and failures of movements, of past social movements, movements for social, economic, and racial equity, it provides us ways of thinking about how to best organize these movements in the present and the future. And this really cuts to the core of kind of my theory of history, is that I believe I don't study history for the sake of understanding what happened in the past. I understand history because history gives us a guide to the present and, more importantly, the future. That if we want to organize movements that will bring about a more just and equitable America, we have to understand what makes movements successful and what doesn't. And I think history can be a tool for helping us create a more equitable and just future. So that's why I think this question is important. Now, to kind of give you a sense of how I answer this question, or how some of my research answers this question, I want to give you a sense of how it is that we as historians work and how I work as a historian and how I kind of, some of my students who I work with, how they work as historians. All right, so, next slide. So, traditionally, the way historians work is you immerse yourself in old records, diaries, newspapers, journals, political records. As a historian, there's no way around it. You got to do a lot of reading. So I got that picture in the background there of a stack of books falling over. When I saw that picture, I just pulled it offline. I actually laughed to myself because that's often what my office looks like right now. It is remarkably clean right now just because I haven't been in it because, us faculty have not been able to work from campus. But as soon as we're allowed back into our offices, that's what my office is going to look like, stacks of books falling over. That's part of the nature of history, is we do a lot of reading, we immerse ourselves in documents. The problem is, one of the things I explained to you is I'm not necessarily interested in the powerful figures or the most prominent figures in history. I'm interested in kind of more the ordinary people who join social movements. And the thing with archives, journals, diaries, newspapers, those tend to focus on powerful, prominent figures. We have tons of records for Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph and Malcolm X, some of the big important leaders of the civil rights movement. We really don't have any records that help us detail and document the lives of some of the people who joined those movements. So as a social historian, one of my biggest challenges is figuring out a way to get to the experiences of some of the people whose names we don't remember. Next slide, please. So, as I say in this slide here, I think, in addition to books, in addition to journals and newspapers and archival records, I think there are plenty of other and oftentimes more interesting places we can look to find evidence of what inspired people to join social movements, to organize, and ultimately to fight for change. And so in my classes, we do look at some traditional documents, but we also look at a lot of what in kind of history would be considered non-traditional documents. Next slide. One of these is art. A lot of times we don't think of art as having a place in history, but I completely disagree. I think if you want to know what people were feeling and experiencing, often you can look to the art they were creating. So these are just two examples of artwork that I use in both my research and that I use in my teaching in a lot of my classes. The first picture on the left there is one of my favorite pictures from the 1960s. It's by Berkeley L. Hendricks. He was a black artist affiliated with the Black Power movement, and this painting is called Icon for My Superman, and in parentheses, Superman never saved any black people. It was painted in 1969. I just love this painting. It's so simple yet so powerful. And in my class and in my research, we spend a lot of time analyzing this painting. How would people have interpreted it? Why did Berkeley Hendricks paint this? What was he trying to say with this? Another example we see on the right, a little more recent example, it's from the mural, it's a mural in Chicano Park in San Diego, California. And same thing, we'll pick apart the, I'll put this on screen in one of my classes and we'll pick apart the imagery and try and understand what it is that the artist was trying to communicate and how people seeing this art would have understood it and what it would have meant to them. And again, I think looking at art like this is a way to get at some of the feelings and experiences of people whose experiences and lives weren't necessarily recorded in archival documents. Next slide. Same thing goes with literature. If you want to understand what it was like to live through the Great Depression, the pain that people suffered in the Great Depression, particularly farmers, I can't think of a better book than John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I think if you want to understand how black people were experiencing the late 60s and 1970s and experiencing Jim Crow, I think there's no better author than James Baldwin. James Baldwin was also gay, and he wrote a lot about what it was like to be a gay black man. Today we call that intersectionality. Baldwin didn't necessarily have a name for it back then, but still, we can understand experiences of different peoples and the diversity of experiences by looking to not just art, but also literature. Next slide. But my absolute favorite thing to talk about in both my research and teaching is music. In all my classes, we listen to a lot of music because, again, I think music is another great way to understand what people were feeling, what they were experiencing, and get at a kind of more emotional level than just documents can help us understand. So one of my favorite singers of all time, also, pretty much I talk about him in all my classes, is Woody Guthrie. He was a famous singer, folk singer in the Depression era. He was very supportive of the civil rights movement. He was very supportive of the labor movement. And his songs, speak to a wide array of American experience that often, don't get recorded in traditional sources. I also think, to understand the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, you got to understand the powerful music that came out of that movement. Singers like James Brown or Aretha Franklin, who really used their music to help motivate people and get them to join the civil rights movement. Next slide. All right, so, I started off with this question of, why are some social movements more effective than others? Now, as you might imagine, that is a huge question, a question which I could probably spend the rest of my life talking about, something I necessarily can't get to in 20 minutes. And if you're interested in that question, all my classes deal with it in some way or another. So I would definitely encourage you to take one of my classes, or again, many of my colleagues in the history department, as well as sociology and political science departments, they deal with similar questions as well. And I think if you really, really want to dive into this question, those are the sorts of classes you can take. But I want to provide one answer now, and I think it's one answer that I think is a bit unique in that focusing on culture helps us understand. So what I often see when you look at some of the music of the civil rights movement, or music of the labor movement, or music of the women's movement, what you often see is that music, art, novels, they provided very important inspiration for activists. Really what music did is it helped people articulate a common cause, and it really reminded people of what they were fighting for. And this became really, really important when these movements were met with violence, as they often were. That when people had, fire hoses and dogs sicked on them during the civil rights movement, when police often tried to suppress, labor strikes with violence or vigilante police forces, it was oftentimes people would look back to music and culture as a foundation, as a bedrock, as something they could say, they could tie their struggle to and help them remember what it is they were fighting for. So I think one of the things that defines successful social movements versus non-successful social movements is that the successful ones have often had a cultural component. They haven't just been people marching in the street or people lobbying political leaders. They have often produced great art and great music and great literature that has helped motivate people and help them carry forward the struggle. So as I say here, and I think this is a good way to kind of sum it up, the most successful social movements in 20th century American history have also been cultural movements. Next slide, please. And I think, and this gives me a lot, I think there's a lot to be pessimistic about in the future. I think there's a lot to be concerned about in the future, especially the future of policing in America, the future of racial equity in America. One of the things that gives me hope, though, and one of the things that I think history helps us understand is that since the recent Black Lives Matter protests and since the murder of George Floyd, even though this just happened fairly recently, there's already been a lot of art that has sprung up around in support of this movement. So here we see a mural painted in Minneapolis. If you just Google George Floyd murals, you can see dozens of just striking, beautiful, powerful murals that are doing the same kind of work some of the arts of the early 20th century did. It's articulating a common cause and helping people kind of remember what it is they're fighting for. We've also seen some really, just in this short period, some really great music in support of the Black Lives Matter movement come out. And I suspect in the coming weeks, months, and years, we will see even more music. So, again, like I said, there's a lot to be concerned about, a lot to be saddened about, a lot to be angry and frustrated about. But if I see one point of optimism, it's that the movement going on right now might have some staying power because it is also creating a cultural component alongside a social and political component. So, next slide, please. All right. So I just want to give you a sense, kind of give you a sense of, kind of the theory, or my theory of history, or maybe what it's a little bit like to, study history here at UO, or, if you work with me. I want to talk a little bit more about kind of teaching and maybe dispel some misconceptions about what it is to study history. So many of you may be thinking that to study history is to simply memorize dates and facts. Again, I think history education in high school has changed significantly since I was in high school. But I remember when I was in high school, pretty much the way you studied for a history exam was you memorized a bunch of dates and then you forgot them immediately afterwards. So I have a little cartoon clip here from Calvin and Hobbes. I used to love Calvin and Hobbes, one of my kind of favorite cultural products of all times. So this is, Calvin, and for those of you who don't know the comic strip, Calvin was just kind of a young kid. He, always was misbehaving. He was a troublemaker, and he had a toy tiger named Hobbes, who was his kind of best friend. But here we see Calvin taking a test. When did the Pilgrims land at Plymouth Rock? Calvin answers 1620, and then writes, as you can see, I've memorized this utterly useless fact long enough to pass a test question. I now intend to forget it forever. And it goes, I can't exactly read it on the screen, but you get the point. And he says there at the end, they say the satisfaction of teaching makes up for the lousy pay. So again, it's a kind of dig at kind of the way history is often taught. But I agree with Calvin on this one. I don't memorize dates. I don't ask my students to memorize dates. I don't ask my students to memorize facts. I'll give you a dirty little secret right now. I barely remember any dates. I of course have a PhD in history, and I can barely, I remember important dates. But most historical dates I don't remember, and if I have to look up a date, I just go to Wikipedia. Really, what's important for history is not remembering dates and facts. It's understanding the why of history, why things happened in the past. More important than that, it's understanding how things that happened in the past continue to impact us today. That is what we focus on in history. And if you take one of my classes, and I really hope you do, that is the sort of thing and the sorts of questions we will be answering. How is it that understanding what happened 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago, how does that continue to impact American society today? What can we learn from the successes of social movements in the past? What can we learn from their failures? And how can that help us create a more just and more equitable future? Next slide. So this is kind of, last kind of bit of wisdom I'll leave you with here, and this is something I say in all my classes. That, as a historian, and in the historians I work with, as both my colleagues as well as students, we don't study the past. We study the present, and we try and understand how things got the way they are. We try and understand why the America of today looks as it does, how historical forces and circumstances created the America of today, and more importantly, though, we think about how we can preserve what's good about our contemporary society and how we can use the lessons of history to more effectively change what's bad. So, last slide. So I will take your questions now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beda. We have time for some questions, and so they've been coming in as you've been talking, and I have several here, and I want to start with one from Tara.
Okay.
Tara asks, as a social historian who looks into the past, do you also research and provide this type of information about current events that will make history to future generations?
Can you just ask the question?
Yes.
Ask the second half of the question one more time?
Yes. Do you also research and provide this type of information about current events that will make history to future generations?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Tara. That's a really great question. And absolutely, oftentimes in my classes, especially this is true in my 20th century history class, we will read a historical document alongside watching a movie clip from something recently, or I assign a lot of podcasts talking about recent events. A lot of times I'll assign opinion pieces that I read in the New York Times that are talking about some current event, especially if there's a debate going on. So obviously now there's a big debate going on about what we do about policing and what we do about how much money the police forces get. I've already got a list of stuff I'm going to assign in my 20th century class in the fall, talking about both the relevant issues and the historical issues. So yeah, absolutely. In my classes, you read history, you read contemporary issues, and again, I don't mean just read. We also watch videos, listen to music. We, like I said, podcasts I use. But anyway, you're going to digest contemporary issues, historical issues, and like I said, most importantly, you're going to understand how those two things are connected.
Perfect. So Ryan has a question. Ryan wants to know, Ryan is asking, how is asking why are some social movements more important than others impactful in today's society? Mm-hmm. What have been some challenges in answering this question?
Yeah, great question, Ryan. So, as I said, I think if you understand what makes a social movement effective, you can repeat those successes. And likewise, if you understand why a social movement failed, you know what to avoid. So that's why I think really understanding kind of why some social movements failed, why some succeeded, that's a really important question, not just for history, but for our future, because it gives us a guide, it gives us a pathway. It helps us know what strategies and tactics are useful and should be repeated, and what sorts of things to avoid. So that's why I think it's an important question. Now, as far as the challenges of, answering that question, as I explained to you, a lot of times the way historical records are organized is, as I said, they often focused on the great powerful men of history, and even social movement archives of social movements. They often focus on leadership and political decisions, and so it's sometimes hard to get a sense of what's going on the ground level. It's hard to understand how kind of rank and file activists participated in these movements, what they did, how they sometimes disagreed with leadership or supported leadership. So really getting at the kind of level of the rank and file, the level of kind of the everyday ordinary activist, that is one of the biggest challenges here. Also too, the other big challenge of kind of evaluating this question about the efficacy of social movements is, where do you want to focus your kind of your historical gaze? So one of the things I just talked about is I really focus my historical gaze on culture. I see how that interacted with social movements. But you got to decide that by focusing on culture, that also means maybe I'm de-emphasizing some of the political story, which could at times can be problematic. So this is one of the challenging things, but I think also very fun things about doing history is, developing a historical narrative, as we do in research and do in teaching, it's really like juggling, keeping 100 different balls in the air at one time. And you got to decide what you're going to prioritize, what you're not going to prioritize, and you got to figure out how you're going to tell the story, whose perspective you're going to tell the story from, and that often creates complications. So great question, though.
So TJ has one that's actually related to the first part of your answer a little bit, and it has to do with what makes this movement, the current movement in Black Lives Matter, seem more successful or more efficacious. So TJ says, I love this field of study, and there's an exclamation point there, so Great. It looks like you've got a future historian on your hands here. What do you think it is specifically that sets this year's increase in the participation of the Black Lives Matter movement apart from previous years? Would you say it is more generation specific or the attention of social media in the movement now?
Wow, wonderful, wonderful question. Trying to think how I want to, again, that's a question I could probably talk about for the next 4 hours if you wanted. So yeah, I think one of the things that's making this movement, well, I will say, I hope this movement is successful. This movement needs to be successful. I can't tell you how much I want this movement to be successful. It's still a little early to know what successes this movement is going to have. Now, like I said, I think there's a lot of hopeful signs. The number of people getting involved. Politicians who have responded to the number of people getting involved. Like I said, I'm putting a lot of hope in the fact that there's now a new kind of cultural edifice that has emerged around this movement that is going to help sustain it and carry it forward into the future. But to the extent that police departments are going to actually be defunded, to the extent that there is going to be more accountability for police in communities of color, it's still too early to tell. Now, in terms of kind of why we see so many people getting involved in this movement, I think partly this movement is building on, some of the successes and failures of kind of the earlier iteration of Black Lives Matter several years ago, is that we saw a kind of big outpouring of protest then. That movement kind of died down. It didn't necessarily have the institutional building and organizational building that it needed. But the memory of that movement was still fresh in people's mind. And after George Floyd's murder, as well as some of the other murders of people of color by police officers, that it was still an open wound, and I think that motivated a lot of people. I also think, again, social media plays a huge role in motivating it. I also think the fact that, this occurred in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis played a role, is that, as many of you will learn or have learned, that COVID-19 is impacting communities of color far more than it is white communities. And so there was a lot of, pent-up frustration and rage about this, and that after George Floyd's murder, that frustration and rage, poured out in the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think there's a lot of reasons why we're seeing a lot of people kind of participate in this movement. But again, I would point to culture and cultural products as an important one, and I think that's, again, encouraging people, motivating people to get involved.
I'm going to sneak a question of my own in after hearing that answer. So my question actually is, what role do you think, and where does the interdisciplinary nature of studying economics in this situation have to do? So is the economic anxiety that people were feeling because of COVID-19 have an impact on the sort of the sustainability of this particular movement in this time, and why so many more people might be out in the streets?
Yeah. So one of the things I love about history, and why I'm such an advocate of learning history, because history is fundamentally an interdisciplinary discipline. You can't study history without understanding economics, without understanding politics, without understanding culture, without understanding demographic change. There's a lot of moving parts in understanding history, and that's what makes it so fascinating. So yeah, economics is a huge part of both the marginalization of communities of color, as well as the way communities of color have responded. It's a central part to the kind of history of civil rights. Is that, yeah, there is a long history, a history that I talk about in all my classes of essentially jobs and economic opportunity leaving communities of color, particularly communities of color in urban areas, that has created healthcare disparities, that has created disparities in economic opportunity, that's created vast disparities in educational opportunity, and in many ways, over-policing and police brutality in urban communities of color is a direct result of some of these economic changes. So, yeah, I mean, I think, and many environmental historians I know would agree with me that one of the reasons that COVID-19 is having is so much more damaging in communities of color has everything to do with the fact that there's not as much economic opportunity and therefore not as good of a healthcare system in many communities of color, and that when you get a pandemic like COVID-19, it just takes a toll on people who don't have access to affordable healthcare, and because of, again, other histories of environmental racism, have other health problems that they're already suffering from.
Thank you. Sorry to sneak my own questions in, but we have some great ones coming in. And Alex is saying, when looking at various different movements throughout the 20th century, do you ever go in depth on different factions within a given movement? And an example being segregationist, integrationist unions, and how those different factions gained more or less influence at the time.
Yeah, Alex, great question. That is kind of really at the core of what I study. One of the things I said is, I keep talking about I want to get to the ordinary people within social movements. And one of the reasons I think that's so important to do is because if you just look at the story of a social movement through the eyes of a leader, people are always unified, everyone's getting along, everyone is following that leader, no questions asked. When you start getting to the kind of people who participate in a social movement, it gets much messier and you see factions all over the place. Absolutely what you're talking about is, within the civil rights movement, you had, Black Power advocates who wanted kind of more independent Black communities. You had people who wanted integration. You had a million different things in between. The history of civil rights in the 60s and 70s is fascinating story of not just civil rights activists fighting segregationists, it's also civil rights activists fighting amongst themselves about their vision for the future. That's so true of the labor movement. And we see echoes of this in kind of some of the debates between Bernie Sanders and, kind of the mainstream Democratic Party today. That debate has its kind of antecedents in the labor movement of, labor activists who are pushing for anti-capitalist policies, who are sometimes pushing for socialism or communism, and labor movement activists who are, just want to a decent wage and kind of what's called bread and butter unionism, just a good day's wage with good benefits. So that debate has really been, a through line throughout the 20th century in the history of radicals and radicalism, and I think we see some of that reflected in the left today. So yeah, I think, to answer your question most directly, you can't study history from the ground up or from the bottom up without really looking at factions and debates within these communities.
So they're still coming in. Storm wants to know, why do you think high school curriculums choose to only talk about quote unquote important figures and not lesser known people who were involved in big events in history? Will that be true of my classes at the U of O as well? Okay,
Storm, great question. Well, first let me answer the easy part first. No, that will not be true of your classes at UO. So as I hope I communicated to all of you, I'm really, sometimes you have to talk about presidents and political leaders because the decisions they make have huge impacts, for everyone. But really my focus is always on, like I say, the lived experiences of people whose names often get left out of the history textbooks. And I can tell you with 100% confidence that every one of my colleagues in the history department has the same approach. That is really why many of us got into history, because we're interested in, like I said, the lived experiences. We look askance and we look askew at the kind of great men of history. So, like I said, rest assured, take a history class at UO, you're gonna get, like I said, this term, history from the bottom up. That is what me and all my colleagues do. In terms of why history textbooks teach history like that. And like I said, I do think it's changing. Again, I'd be interested to know, Storm, kind of what your experience was with high school history. I think it is tied into very racialized notions of what it means to be an American. That I think a lot of times the people who write history textbooks tend to be white men. And as white men, they look to powerful white men of the past, and they say, here's what we as a society should emulate. I think that's part of the reason, is that we don't have enough diversity in people, writing history textbooks, and if we had more, people would bring different experiences. So I think that's part of the problem. I think another part of the problem too is a lot, history, all, scholarly study is politicized, but history is really, really politicized. And I think a lot of times people or school boards, teachers aren't the problem. I think it's oftentimes school boards are the problem. They believe that the function of history is to celebrate America and Americanism. And there's a lot to celebrate, and there's a lot of good about America, but there's a lot that's bad about America. And I don't think history should just be a celebration. It should be a critical interrogation and an understanding. And again, I will talk about what's good and I will talk about what's bad. You can't really understand history without both. But because so many textbook authors or school boards have seen, the function of history is to celebrate America, they've talked about these great white men and left out the fact that they owned slaves or they supported segregation or all these ugly things that I think give us a more complete and a more useful kind of picture of history. That's a great question, though.
Yeah, they're great questions. I've got another one here. I'm going to ask you two more. Drew says, you say that understanding the successes of the past movements is an important part of continuing to be successful in the present. What are some things that you would suggest for a current activist to do in order to contribute to the success of the Black Lives Matter movement?
So great question, Drew. I want to emphasize I'm a historian. I teach about the past. I think the past is really important, but it's not my role to tell activists how they should and shouldn't go about doing their business, right? If I had the answers to be a good activist, I would be out in the streets instead of in my office or in a college classroom. Again, so I'm reticent to prescribe something for activists because I think, as recent history has shown, Black Lives Matter activists don't need my help. They're doing a damn fine job without Steve Beda's advice. If you want to kind of press me for advice, I think one of the important things of social movements is social movements, like I said, have a cultural component, which we talked about. I also think what's important for social movements is to not just organize marches and organize protests, but also build organizations. So if you look at some of the civil rights movements or civil rights organizations of the 1960s, the most effective ones really invested a lot in not just building, organizing marches, but actually building an organization with staff, with people to help sustain the movement, during lulls. Putting together essentially databases of activists that they could call on in crucial times. But again, I'd reiterate, like I said, it's been so inspiring to see all these people standing up against police brutality in support of racial equity that, like I said, no one needs Steve Beda's help. I think everyone's going to be just fine without me. But if you want to understand kind of the historical antecedents, that's where I can come in.
Well, so that leads us to the final two kinds of questions. One student is asking, what kinds of classes should a student take if they're interested in this subject area? And then we've had multiple students say, how can I take a class with you? And what type of classes do you teach? So if you want to talk a little bit about your own teaching, and particularly this fall as students are thinking about their own class schedule.
Sure.
And then what else could they take?
Sure. So this fall I am teaching History 203. It's the kind of 20th century American survey class. It's one of my favorite classes to teach. Essentially the way I teach it is thematic. So we'll talk about kind of issues about immigration, we'll talk about the history of civil rights, we'll talk about kind of labor rights and kind of economic change. But really, it's the 20th century survey, but I go in depth on kind of a few themes and topics I choose, themes and topics that are relevant to conversations we're having in 2020 America. So like I said, it's called the Survey of 20th Century American History, but really it ends up being a class about the history of immigration, civil rights, and workers' rights and labor rights. So that's what I'm teaching this fall. The other class I'm teaching this fall, it's an experimental one. I've already taught it once before, but it's called Trump's America. And it is looking at all the kind of different, it's not about Trump and it's not about his administration, even though we'll talk about his administration. It's about all the forces that have led to kind of Trump's political rise. So we'll talk about histories of white supremacy, we'll talk about histories of xenophobia and anti-immigration politics, and we'll just look at, one of the questions that class asks is, a lot of people are saying, oh my God, the Trump administration and the Trump presidency is unprecedented. And the question asks, the question the class asks, is it? So we'll look at what's new about the Trump administration and what isn't. Again, doing what I do in all my classes, using history to better understand the present. The other two classes I teach with regularity are the U.S. and Vietnam. So we'll talk about kind of, as the title implies, the Vietnam War, but also how it reshaped domestic America. And then the other class I teach is the history of the Pacific Northwest. So again, that really focuses on environmental issues here in the Pacific Northwest, how we manage forests, water, indigenous resource rights, talks about the ways in which, social and racial and gender inequities often intersect with environmental problems. So that's kind of, those are my kind of core classes. I also teach, what else do I also teach? Well, those are kind of my core, and I have kind of just a rotating, a couple other classes I teach from time to time. I also do some of the kind of research seminars in the history department. So if you become a history major, which I hope many of you do, and in your junior, senior year, you have to write a big kind of history paper, and I teach the class that guides you through that. In terms of other classes you can take, I think in the history department, you can't go wrong. I can tell you for certain that all my colleagues, we all care about, like I said, understanding the present through we all care about issues about gender and gender equality and how we can understanding the history of these movements or how some of these problems were created. I think those are kind of you can't go wrong with a history class. Also think many classes in political science focus on issues of race and racism in the political system. Many classes in sociology focus on some of the kind of social theories about race and racism. So really there's, again, I actually don't have the class list in front of me, so I can't tell you what are good and what are bad, but I actually think there are probably more, for students who really want to learn about social inequities, racial inequities, gender inequities, I think there are so many classes you can take. And I will, again, just because I don't have I don't know exactly what's being offered in the fall, but if any of you watching want to email me, you're free to email me and ask my thoughts or advice. I'm happy to communicate with any student, prospective or committed, or answer any questions over email. That's part of what I'm here for, is to help students navigate this curriculum and navigate their place here at UO.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end things today. So thank you so much, Dr. Beda. I really appreciate your time today, and I know that the students were really engaged in your talk, and it sounds like you've got several of them really excited about the potential of maybe studying some history this fall. For students, if you're wanting to complete your reflection on this faculty perspectives, we want you to log into community.uoregon.edu and follow the prompts through the faculty perspectives page, and you'll be able to complete that and any of the other faculty perspectives that you watch live or afterward. Also, for other questions or concerns, if you'd like us to connect you with Professor Beda, we can do that if you email us at orientation@uoregon.edu. You can also text us at 541-346-1159. And of course, our whole calendar of programs throughout the summer is listed at orientation.uoregon.edu on the web. So thank you so much, Dr. Beda. Really thank you for your time today. It was an incredible talk, and thank you to you students and family members who are watching today as well. Have a great day.